いうわけで、昨日の続きをします。DML、DS、続き。
You to group styles together and target them to devices based on some...
なんだ、メディアクエリ。
Media queries allow you to group styles together and target them to devices based on some criteria. For example, you could target a device by its width, its height, or orientation, like landscape or portrait. Of course, one of the most obvious differences between viewing a website on a desktop browser and your cell phone is the screen size. Remember that using CSS, you have the power to produce very different web page layouts from the same HTML. Remember cssgarden.com? So it only makes sense then that the most common way to adjust the styling and layout of your page is to provide different styles for different screen sizes of the user's devices. This is why it's crucial to learn at least the basics of how to utilize media queries. Without them, responsive design, which we'll start talking about fairly soon, wouldn't be possible. Let's go ahead and explore the basic syntax of media queries. A media query starts with the keyword @media, and then it is followed by a media feature and followed by curly braces. Within those curly braces, you have your styles. It's basically like a style sheet within a style sheet. Each media feature resolves to either true or false, and you can have more than one media features combined together using logical operators. If the media features resolve to true, the style within the curly braces apply. When writing media queries, make sure you close the curly braces for the media query as a whole, and then separately each styling rule. There are quite a bit of these media features that are available. So you could have max width, you can have min width, you can have height, which is not listed here. You can even target orientation of your device, portrait or landscape. You can target only screens as opposed to targeting only print. Again, if any of these things evaluate to true, the styles contained within the curly braces of the media query will be in effect. As I mentioned before, even though there are quite a bit of these media features that are available, the most common ones are the max width and the min width. And again, the fact that they're most common really is connected to the fact that the most common way of targeting different devices is by the width of the device. In addition, as I said before, the media features can be combined using logical operators. One of the most common logical operators is the AND operator. As an example, here's a code snippet that targets a width range. Here you see we're targeting any device that falls within the range of its width being anywhere from 768 pixels until 991 pixels. If the device has a width that is smaller than that or larger than that, the styles applied within this media query will not apply. Another way to combine media features is to place a comment between them, which would basically translate into being equivalent to an OR operator. In this code snippet, we're showing that we're targeting any device whose width is no larger than 767 pixels, or any device that is at least 992 pixels in width. Now, practically speaking, when you approach responsive design and responsive layouts, the most common logical operator is the AND operator. So if you know that operator, you're in pretty good shape. Now, before we jump into a code example, I'd like to show you a very common approach how you structure media queries within your style sheet. What usually happens is you have a few of these media queries, but you almost always start with some base styles. Base styles will apply across the board, no matter what screen size you actually are viewing the website on. And then you go ahead and start targeting a particular screen size by either changing some of the properties of the base styles or adding something else to them, or maybe taking something away. Now, an important point to point out, and especially when you're using widths of screen sizes of the devices, is that you have to be very careful not to overlap range boundaries. So in this example, you will notice that the first query has the minimum width of 1200 pixels, and the second query is coming up, it's a range again, and it comes up to max width of 1199 pixels. If I were to say 1200 pixels, it will mean they're always inclusive. It will mean that both sets of styles will apply, and most probably things will be pretty messy and very hard to maintain. So it's important when you structure these media queries that you have very clean, separate boundaries. In part 2 of this lecture, we're going to jump into the code editor and see these concepts in action.
さあ。メディアクエリ続き。実際にやってみようとね。
Okay, so I'm in Sublime Text and I'm looking at the file called media queries before.html. And it's located in the examples lecture 23 folder. Let's take a quick look at the structure of our HTML. And it's a very simple one. Again, just a H1 just to tell us where we're holding. And all we have in our HTML really is 2 paragraphs. First one is ID'd with P1 and the second one is ID'd with P2. Let's take a look at the styles that we have for these paragraphs so far. As you can see, we're following our own advice and we have some base styling that we're going to apply to these paragraphs before we even get to the media queries. We're not going to pay too much attention to H1. That's just really for our web page to look a little bit more decent. We'll pay attention to the paragraph tags, however. So here we're targeting our paragraph and basically just giving it a border of 1 pixel solid black and giving it a bottom margin of 15 pixels. And then we're distinguishing each paragraph by using the ID selector by giving it a particular color. And the first paragraph is going to be fairly large. It's going to be 300 pixels by 300 pixels. And the second one is going to be a different color and it's going to be 50 pixels by 50 pixels. Well, let's take a look as to what this looks like in the browser. So here are our 2 paragraphs. One is fairly large, another one is small. Let's take a look at what happens if we make the browser width smaller and smaller and smaller. And as you can see, really nothing happens at all, right? We could go on and nothing is going on. So let's take a look as to what we could do with our media queries. So here I have a couple of sections that I specifically designated for our media queries. The first one is going to try to target large devices only. So what are large devices? Well, large devices in my vocabulary will be anything that is at least 1200 pixels wide. So we'll go ahead and write media query for that. And the min width, right, min width is going to be 1200, and don't forget pixels, and we'll open the curly brace and close the curly brace, and we're ready to target our paragraphs just for devices that are at least as large as 1200 pixels wide. So we'll go ahead and do our first paragraph, and what we'll do is we'll change its width to, let's say, not Windows width, to let's say 80%. So what that will mean is that paragraph number 1 at width 1200 pixels or wider will take 80% of our screen. As for paragraph number 2, we'll make it that its width is 150 pixels, which is a little bit larger than it is, actually 3 times as large, right? Because it was 50 pixels before, and we'll actually change its height to 150 pixels as well, so it will be a perfect square. Okay, so let's save our file and switch to our browser. Let's reload. And let's take a look. Since our browser now is definitely wider than 1200 pixels, you see that both of the paragraphs actually were affected. Now, how do I know that my browser is wider than 1200 pixels? Well, if I press Command Option I, or on PC's Control Option I will bring up my Chrome developer tools. And now if I start dragging the side of the browser, you'll see in the top right corner that it's showing you the actual size. And you see something else interesting. You see at 1200 pixels, 1214 pixels, and as we go smaller and smaller, when it goes to past 1200 pixels, you see that everything jumps to its original base sizes, right? And if I make it a little bit wider again, it will jump again to the styles that the media query with min width 1200 pixels specified. Let's go back and make this larger again. Okay, so let's switch back to our code and write one more media query, but this time for medium-sized devices. So what are medium-sized devices? Well, Media size devices is probably something around 992 pixels and 1199 pixels. Now, where am I pulling out these numbers? Well, I'll tell you the secret. I'm cheating a little bit. I'm pulling them out of the standard ranges, width ranges, that the Twitter Bootstrap framework defines for its different media device sizes. We'll speak about Twitter Bootstrap fairly soon, but for
モデル
now,
サイズ
our
の場合
media
は
queries should
両
be
方やると。
minimum width of 992 pixels, and remember that and max width of 1199 pixels. And remember, we're trying to make sure that we don't overlap with the previous media query. Otherwise, we're basically going to end up applying both styles again. So we're going to open up the curly brace, and we'll target again paragraph 1. And we'll go ahead and make it smaller. We'll make its width still in percent, but at least we'll make it as small. We'll make it 50%. And paragraph number 2, we'll make its width to 100 pixels. So again, a little bit smaller than for a larger screen size. And the height also will make it 100 pixels. So now you can see that our base size makes the first one 300 by 300, second 50 by 50. If the screen width falls into the range of 992 pixels and 1199 pixels, we're going to increase our size of the first one, and we'll make it 50% of the screen. And paragraph number 2 will become 100 by 100 instead of 50 by 50. And if we stretch our browser all the way to 1200 pixels and above, the first paragraph will become 80% of the screen, and the second paragraph will become 150 pixels large. And obviously, none of this makes any sense in terms of nice layout. This is really just as an example to try it out. So let's switch to the browser and see how that worked out. Let's make this a little bit smaller so we could see all of them, but still see the screen sizes. And go ahead and refresh it. So we're now at above 1200. As we go a little bit slower to 1200, when we get to a little bit less than 1200, we switch to our second media query, which makes this be 50% of the screen as opposed to 80. If we could go back, we could see the 80% of the screen. That's the 80% of the screen. And go a little bit down. And if we're below 1200, this is 80%, 50% of the screen, and this is 100 by 100 pixels. And if we go even below 992 pixels, as we get closer and we switch from 992 to 991, you could see that we're back to our base styling because we have no media query that is defined for that particular screen size. Now, I'd like to show you one more thing that the Chrome Developer Tools has here. You'll see this cell phone looking icon. If we click that, we'll see a whole different view of our page that we're able to play with. And it tells us here that we might need to reload it. So we'll go ahead and reload that right now to get rid of that warning. But you see here, I could select any device I want and even select between portrait and landscape mode and see what my website looks like in that on that particular device. And I can also go ahead and change the device size right here just by dragging the border of this thing. And one more thing is, if you take a look, it actually shows us in our own CSS that we loaded into this page, what are the different ranges in terms of the media queries that exist. And you can see here, we have one that's from 992 pixels to 1199, and the other one from 1200 and on. And if we go ahead and start selecting some devices, let's see, what does it look like on the Apple iPad? It looks just like that in the portrait mode, but if I switch, it will be in landscape mode. It's telling us again to refresh. Go ahead and do that. And you can see that we can actually go and see what happens at these breakpoints, and the points between one media query and another one, it's called breakpoints. So we're now going towards our second breakpoint, and when we get there, you see that our first box basically made itself 80%, and I can't remember what the size of that box anymore is, but you see the difference. And if we jump back, now this one is applying, and if we make it even smaller than that, that breakpoint, 992 pixels, and 991 pixels, the breakpoint will change, and now we are back to our base styling. So Chrome Developer Tools are incredibly useful when you're trying to design and test and basically see and debug a little bit your responsive designs. So in summary, we looked at a basic syntax of a media query, and remember it's @media with some media feature in parentheses, or you could combine media features with some logical operator. So here we have media feature in parentheses followed by some logical operator, and in responsive layouts it's usually the AND operator, and then followed another media feature also again in parentheses. Remember not to overlap breakpoints. We talked about how if we structure our media queries with different widths of different devices, that the breakpoints of these widths should not overlap even by 1 pixel. Usually the way you approach this is you provide some base styling and then you change or add to them in each of the media queries. And usually structuring your CSS in this way makes it much cleaner and also much easier to maintain down the line. Next, we're going to speak about responsive layouts.
レスポンシブデザインの今のメディアクエリについて。今から、聞いてみたけど、メディアクエリ、なんか1メディアクエリは違う気がするけど、The user approach to using media queries is to provide some base styling. まずベーススタイルに合わせて、then change and add. ただ変更または追加される。then with each media query. OK だ。レクチャー24。
Responsive design was born primarily out of the need to deal with the explosion of mobile devices that started being able to browse the web, much in the same way that a desktop browser user browsed the web. I found this line graph on the web, and it's attributed to some research done by Morgan Stanley Research. I don't really know how exact any of these numbers are, but the general point is well known. Browsing on mobile devices exceeds that of regular desktop browser. And if you look at this graph, that sounds just about right, that this actually happened around 2013, 2014. So it's been a little bit since that happened. So the point is, you just can't ignore mobile. You have to design your sites for mobile as well. But when it comes to mobile, there's so many devices. So which devices do we want to target and which devices do we want to support? And the answer is really all of them. You can't really afford to ignore any of them. There's such a plethora of these devices out there, and ignoring some of them would ignore a chunk of your user base. So how does responsive design help us do that? Well, I think the answer lies in what responsive design is. So what is a responsive website? Well, that's a site that's designed to adapt its layout to the viewing environment by using fluid, proportion-based grids, flexible images, and CSS3 media queries. And by proportion-based grids, what we mean is, or hinting to, is that the width of these grids, or these columns, as we'll see in a moment, should be specified using a percentage. I really like this visualization that somebody put together and put on Wikipedia when you search for responsive design. So this is one of the images on that page. And this is basically paraphrasing, or maybe actually taking verbatim, a quote from Bruce Lee, a famous martial arts expert. And basically it says, you put water in a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water in a bottle, it becomes the bottle. And you put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. And the idea is pretty simple. The content should be like water. You put it in whatever different devices you put it into, and it should still display, the content should be the same, and the information conveyed should be the same. And perhaps the only thing that's different is the shape of that content, right? The way it's being displayed. So using kind of the idea of the previous graphic, we could certainly understand now that the site's layout is supposed to adapt to the size of the device. In practice, most of the time, if not all the time, this means that the site should adjust based on the width of the device. And I should also point out that content verbosity, or its visual delivery, may change. For example, for a restaurant site, a phone number, which used to be displayed somewhere in the site without attracting too much attention to itself for a desktop version of that site, is now front and center and the most prominent item on the page on the mobile site. And that's perhaps because we want people to have the phones, once they have the phone, to be able to just to tap and call and put their order in, or perhaps we just don't have the flexibility in a mobile device to let them go and find that phone number somewhere else or just glance at it because of our real estate, being so small. That's number one. Number two is some parts of the site may even be hidden on a mobile version, as we now have to measure very carefully which parts are the most crucial. Now, are there any alternatives to the
まあ、ス
responsive
マート
design
フォンで
principles?
サイトを見
Well,
るな
actually, there
ら、
are. What you could do is you could
メ
have
モ
a
をつけるにし
server-side
た方がいいよね
technology
と
that
か、
detects your user agent, in other words, the type of browser that you're using, and figure
その
out whether
話
or
前
not
の
you're on a
方だ。
mobile device or on a desktop device. And
モバイル
then,
サイ
based on
ト
that
と
information,
PC サイト
either
が分ける
serve
から
up
だ
a
ね。
regular desktop version of the website or serve up to the client the mobile version of that website. And this is basically what the websites that wanted to have a mobile version as well used to do before the responsive design kind of came to the forefront. But the problem is there's a couple of issues with this type of approach. Number one is you have high risk of feature diversion between apps because now you really, technically speaking, now have really two different applications running your website. One is a mobile version, one is a desktop version, number one. And number two is, well, mobile devices are just too varied in size among themselves. So it's hard to make a mobile site that satisfies every client. So what ends up happening is that you
モバイ
end
ル
up
サイトの方
sacrificing
は
user
利用する
experience
例
because you're trying to
増え
kind
た
of
か
make
ら、
one mobile website that fits them all. And that basically never works. So nowadays, by and large, because of these issues, people really stay away from this approach. The largest part of responsive design is obviously the layout. And the most common layout out there, or responsive layout, is a 12-column grid responsive
まあ、
layout.
大体
And this is
今、
what
グリッドレイアウト
Bootstrap,
を使
Twitter
うから、
Bootstrap
こういう
uses,
感じにな
and
る。
just about almost really every responsive framework out there uses nowadays. And the reason 12 is what's used is because of the factors of 12. You could basically, it's evenly nicely divisible by 1, 2,
3
3,
分
4,
割や4
6,
分
and
割
obviously 12
できるから
itself.
便利だ
Which
よね。
means we could subdivide our page into sections that are evenly split and nicely lay out themselves. So for example, we could have content that is split into 3 columns out of the 12. So it's 3, 3, 3, 3, so that all adds up to 12. Now, in case you're confused, I just left some padding here. I guess I kind of assumed there's going to be some padding over there just for visualization and be able to see the different columns easier. And obviously you can have 6 and 6 in this layout, and 4, 4, and 4, and any other combination you want. You can have 8 and 4, you can have 9 and 3, and so on. And the approach to these responsive layouts is that we know that the browser window is 100%, right? That's the width of the browser window, which means that we can calculate what one column in this 12-column grid layout is.
8%
That's 100% divided by 12,
100%
and that turns out to be
絶対数字分
about
割する。
8.33%, which
90%
means
yeah.
when we specify in our framework, in our Bootstrap or whatever it is we're using, how wide a particular column should be, we could convert these threes into 25% because 3 columns is 25% of 12 columns, and the 6 columns become 50% of the 12 column, and the 4, 4, 4 becomes 33.33%. And obviously, we're not limited to having just one 12-column grid layout. We could certainly have nested ones. So if you have 4, 4, and 4, inside each 4 columns, we can consider that 100% and then have another 12-column grid layout inside of it. So here in the first, on the left one, we see 6 and 6, and the middle one, we see a bunch of 3s. And the left one, or the most right one, we see 4, 4, and 4. And that's totally acceptable. In fact, is done all the time. Okay, so enough theory for part 1 of this lecture. And in part 2 of this lecture, we're going to go ahead and jump into the code editor and see these concepts in action.
レスポンシブだと、12分割が、それを見せ、
Okay, so here I am in Sublime Text, and I'm looking at the file named responsive_before.html, which is located in the examples lecture 24 folder. First, we're going to style a paragraph tag because we're going to use it as our visual kind of anchor to see where the elements fall. And basically, I'm just giving it some background color, some border, and giving it a specific height of 150 pixels. And I'm giving it a width of 90 pixels kind of to simulate some padding. So it's not going to take up the entire cell in our grid. It's going to take up 90% of it. And here, actually, I'm using this little trick to center our paragraph tag inside a block level element, which is going to be a div. And the way to center it is to make sure the width is specified, and then to give it margin right out auto and margin left auto. Okay, so here comes our framework, our responsive framework we're going to code up. It's going to be pretty simple, but pretty effective as well. So here, first we define our row, and all it is just saying that it's going to be 100% of wherever you put the row is going to try to take up 100% of that space. And then we're going to start having some media queries. So the first one is min width is 1200 pixels, which means that if the device display is larger than 1200 pixels, all these styles will apply. And notice that what we're doing is we're defining these columns, and we are marking them with LG for large, and 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And what we're saying is every single column, they should float left. So basically, we're going to have a float-based layout. I also gave each one of them a border, but that's just so we could see it on the screen. And then what I'm doing is pretty simple and something that I've described before. And what I'm doing is I'm just saying, okay, so if it's a 12-column layout, that means each column is 100% divided by 12. So that becomes 8.33%. Well, the 2 columns is 100 divided by 12 times 2, and that's 16.66%. And so on until we get to column large 12, and that's going to take up 100% of the entire grid. And these are the styles that we've defined for large screen devices. Now, what about medium screen devices? What we're going to do is we're going to have a range. And I picked the lower part of the range to be 950 pixels, which is not exactly the standard. Twitter Bootstrap has a different number that it uses. But I just picked this for demo purposes because I'm going to need it to demonstrate something for you, and you'll see that in a minute. And again, I'm listing all these classes, and again, they're going to be left, floating left, and again, I'm giving him a border. And this time, I'm doing the same thing, except I am now calling this MD for medium. And since these classes don't really exist outside of these media queries, it means that I could specify for different devices different layouts depending on device size. So I could, for a smaller device, for example, specify layout expressed in MD and medium devices columns or medium devices classes. And for a larger device, I could express the same thing with LG larger devices. So I could give the same element 2 different classes, and I know I'm guaranteed that only one of them will apply at a time since my media queries don't overlap. So both classes will never really be existing at the same time. And I could define more of these media queries, but for demonstration purposes, let's stop here and let's take a look at our HTML. Well, again, we have our H1 just to announce to the world what we're trying to do. And here we have one single row. A single row contains 8 divs. It contains 8 items, 8 divs. Each one has a paragraph that says item 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 8. And notice the classes that I'm assigning to each one. What I'm trying to tell the browser is that when it is a large device, I want only the classes with LG to apply, and it will happen automatically since the classes with MD don't even exist according to the browser when the browser is larger in width than 1200 pixels. And since I know that floating elements just float to the next line when they can't fit, I could very easily set up 3, 3, 3 and continue to 3. So that's right there, 12 columns, but I can keep going because it's just going to float to the next line. It's 3, 3, 3, and 3 again. So really I should have basically 4 of these things, right? 3, 3, and 3, and 3. That's 4 columns across. However, when the browser size or the device size becomes smaller and it becomes less than 1200 pixels or 1199 pixels and lower, I want the layout to switch to these classes. And these classes are specifying that they should really, each item, each one of these things should take half the screen. So 6 columns plus 6 columns will take up the entire width of the screen. And again, another couple of 6 columns will take the entire width of the screen, and so on. So as I squeeze the browser and make it narrower, I should see that my 4-column layout, which is expressed in these 3s, right? It's a little confusing, but it's 3 columns and there's 12 columns altogether, so you have 4 columns across. So my 4-column layout, as I squeeze the browser and make it narrower, should become a 2-column layout because I'm now specifying in a smaller device size 6 and 6 instead of 3, 3, and 3. Now, when the browser size gets to less than 950 pixels, none of these classes will exist as far as the browser will concern. And what's going to happen then? Well, our divs will no longer be floated because the floating is only defined inside the media queries, which means they will behave just like regular block level elements, and they will automatically stack one on top of the other. So as the device size gets smaller and smaller, I should really have one column with each one of these items stacked one on top of the other. And the truth be told, I could have specified that media query for that size of the device, but since in this case, it's just a demo, and I knew that the items will stack anyway, I just left it alone this way. Let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like in the browser. Okay, so here's our 3, 3, 3, and 3 layout, which gives us 4 items across, and it's just spilling over to the next line and gives us another 4 items across again. And notice if I squeeze the browser, in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to open Chrome Developer Tools. So as I squeeze in this corner right here, you'll see the pixel size of the viewport. And as I start squeezing the browser, you see it jumps to 2, right? As it gets closer and closer to 1200, once it gets past 1200 pixels, right, it becomes now 6 and 6 column layout, which means that now we're taking up half the space of the entire width of the browser. And if we squeeze it past 950, let's take a look and squeeze it past 950 pixels. Right here, boom, the items are now stacking one on top of the other. And obviously, as I pull it back apart, or pull it wider, it becomes back to our 3, 3, and 3 layout, 3, 3, 3, and 3 layout 4 times, and now we have 4 column layout across. So that's pretty cool. So it seems we're done, and we could now serve this website to regular mobile phones. So let's take a look at what this site looks like on an iPhone 6, and I'll go ahead and record the screen of it. Okay, so here I am on my phone, and I'm serving up the website using this tool called Browser Sync. And we're going to talk more about this tool when we get to the development of a real restaurant website, just in a few lectures. But for now, bear with me, and you can barely see here, so let me zoom in here, right here. Responsive before the HTML, I'll go ahead and click that. And here we go. So here we have our website. But something's really strange. I thought if we go on a mobile site, that's a pretty small device, we wouldn't have 2 columns, we would have 1 column because it's such a small device. It seemed to have worked in our browser. Why isn't it working on the phone? Well, let's go back to the browser and investigate this a little bit. So let's go ahead and investigate this, and we're going to use Chrome Developer Tools to do that. And if you look at Chrome Developer Tools here, you'll see a little mobile phone looking like icon, and if you click that, it'll give you basically the layout that we've seen before when we investigated media queries. And right now it's set to some laptop device. So we're going to go and switch that to iPhone 6. And when we switch to iPhone 6, it tells us that we should reload. Let's go ahead and do that. And now that we reloaded, our iPhone simulator device is showing us exactly the same thing as the real iPhone was showing us before. Let's take a look at one of these elements that was supposed to take up the entire screen and for some reason is only taking up half. Let's go ahead and take a look at its box model sizing. So let's take a look here. This div right here is saying that it is 480 pixels wide. And that's really impossible because the screen itself is only 375 pixels wide. So what's going on here? Well, Chrome Developer Tools is actually giving us a hint as to what's going on here. Take a look at the right side of the screen. It's showing you the zooming level of the phone simulator. What it's telling you is that it's only 40% of its 100% zoom. It basically just means the phone zoomed out. And this is really a default feature on all the phones. They try to zoom out on websites that don't tell them to do anything different, so they can try to fit the entire content into the viewport of the phone. So how do we tell the phone's browser that, no, this is actually a responsive website and you don't need to try to zoom out, just stay at the regular zoom level? Well, the way we do that is by specifying a special meta tag. Let's go ahead and switch to our code editor again, and we'll go all the way to the top, and we'll place one more meta tag here. And the name of this meta tag is called viewport. And what we need to tell it is that the content of our viewport is, first of all, consider its width to be device width. Don't try to zoom out. And also its initial scale to be 1. And we'll close the meta tag. So now with this meta tag in place, the browser will consider the device width as the width of the viewport. And its initial scale factor will be 1, meaning it won't scale anything up or down. And now let's go ahead and switch back to the browser, and you see that now it switched to being one column. Just for fun, let's go ahead and try it out on a real phone and see if it worked. Okay, so here we are again. We're trying to serve up this responsive before the HTML. Let's go ahead and click on it. And sure enough, we can see that it worked. It now is only one column, and we could scroll up and down, and it is indeed one column layout now. So in summary, we went over the idea and the need of responsive design. And we talked about the 12-column grid layout, which is the most common and most convenient grid layout there is out there right now. And we spoke about the fact that in order to achieve fluid width, we actually use percentages to specify the width of each column and different items within the columns as well. And we also spoke about the fact that we needed to tell the devices out there that they should not try to zoom out and try to fit all the contents they can. Instead, they should behave as they are, mobile devices with more narrow screens and smaller screens. And the way we tell those devices all this information is by using this meta tag, the viewport meta tag. Next, we're going to start getting introduced to the Twitter Bootstrap framework.
Bootstrap のフレームワークはテールウィンドかね。What's the time of use the GM grid? Yes. The GM grid means that one cell in that grid was tails plus the constant width that device as L width and set zoomed to it. Zoomed or zoomed out. Yes. In
this lecture, we're going to start introducing Bootstrap, which is a CSS framework, one of the most popular CSS frameworks, which was made by the engineers at Twitter. Now, what is Bootstrap? Well, Bootstrap is the most popular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript framework for developing responsive, mobile-first projects on the web. And this is a direct quote from the Bootstrap website. So let's take it apart a little bit. First of all, it's the most popular framework. Well, GitHub, which is basically a large website with code repository that has a social component to it, has over 90,000 stars or likes of the Bootstrap project. So it's the most popular project on the entire website. And it's been forked over 38,000 times. Bootstrap consists mostly of CSS. It predefines a lot of CSS classes for you. So, a lot of the times, especially with a user interface that's a bit more complex than just a single HTML element or something, CSS needs to target a certain HTML structure. Well, because of that reason, Bootstrap oftentimes requires you to have a particular HTML structure in your HTML page. In practice, however, it's not as scary as that sounds. It doesn't really invade your HTML code and make you write some crazy HTML constructs. It just asks you to add an extra div here and there and give it a particular class so that the CSS Bootstrap defined would apply properly. Its JavaScript framework shouldn't be overlooked either. It has a very cool JavaScript framework actually based on the jQuery APIs and plugin architecture that lets you put in, or lets others put in, different plugins that really enhance your website quite a bit. Bootstrap is also called a mobile-first framework. Now, what does that mean? Well, in general, the term means that you deal with how your user interface is laid out on a mobile device first. In reality, from what I've seen, there are two approaches to what this means. There's the purist approach, which says you code your mobile version first. And the claim is that it really helps your content strategy. How are you going to lay out your content, what the content should be? It really forces you to think what's really important in your content that you're about to present. There's also a second approach to what mobile first means, and I would call that not 100% purist approach. And I kind of count myself among that type of thinking group. So the idea there is that you plan for mobile in your styles, but you can start coding with desktop version first if it feels more comfortable for you, or if it just makes more sense for your project. Ooh, I could just feel all the user experience purists over there
衝
getting
撃方
upset
が
at me
極
for
め
saying that. Oh well. So as far as coding is concerned, I would say either approach, starting from mobile and going to desktop, or starting from desktop and going to mobile, are really two valid approaches. However, everybody will agree on this, that mobile first definitely means is that you plan for mobile from the start. You don't ignore it until the end or the
最初
middle
に
of
モ
your
バイルの
project.
移動か
You
ら作る。
plan for it from the start. And they also agree that CSS framework, whether written by you or you take something like Bootstrap, should be mobile ready already. And what that means is that it shouldn't be, again, an afterthought where after you've set up your desktop version, somehow you have to write some or include some other CSS that would now kind of magically try to turn this, the entire website into this mobile website as well. And interestingly enough, Bootstrap wasn't always a mobile first framework. It used to be, I forgot which version that was already, I think maybe 2 or something like that, that Bootstrap had a separate CSS file and a separate set of classes if you wanted your website to be responsive or be able to be viewed on mobile devices as well. But nowadays, Bootstrap is a mobile first framework. So are there any disadvantages of using Bootstrap versus, for example, writing your own like we did in the previous lecture? Well, the number one complaint, the disadvantage of Bootstrap is that it's too big and it's too bloated. And what that means is there's a lot of features in there that you will probably never use. Well, the mitigating factor is you could use selective download on the Bootstrap website and only download the features you actually think you will use. But the truth of the matter is, and even though it is a little bit too bloated, it's not really that bad. And the claim also is that you could write your own framework that's more targeted and therefore much smaller. Well, that may be true, but it will take you a lot longer to write it, and certainly take you a lot longer to write it just as well as the guys at Twitter did, which they put a lot of thought and a lot of painstaking decisions into every little turn that you'll probably just not have the time and the bandwidth to deal with. In part 2 of this lecture, let's jump into the code editor and take a look at what a basic bare bones Bootstrap HTML document looks like and how to properly set it up. Okay, so here I am in Sublime Text, and I'm looking at the file called index.html, which is located in the examples lecture 25 folder. You can see there are some extra folders that are inside the lecture 25 folder, namely CSS, fonts, and JS folders. Now, where did I get them? Well, they come from the installation, or download to be more exact, of Bootstrap. So let's switch to the Bootstrap webpage, which can be found at getbootstrap.com. And we're looking at the Getting Started page. You could look at actually the front page. Here's that quote that I actually put on one of the slides. But if we click on Getting Started, the very first section here is download. And we could choose a whole bunch of different options here, but the simplest one is to choose Bootstrap itself. It's already compiled from some sources, and you can just click download. When you download this and unzip it, inside that zip file, you'll have 3 folders. And the 3 folders will be CSS, fonts, and JS. And if you open up the CSS folder, you'll see that this is where the Bootstrap CSS is located, and bootstrap.min.css. It's just a different version of Bootstrap CSS. That is the minified version, meaning they removed all the spaces and extra things like that, that when you download it to your browser, you know, those extra spaces and carriage returns wouldn't be downloaded because they don't really make any difference. Then there's the fonts folder, and we're not going to talk about this right now, but it's definitely needed for basic Bootstrap functionality. And there's the JS or JavaScript folder. And Bootstrap does have a JavaScript component, so you're definitely going to need this. And again, there's 2 different files. There's bootstrap.js and there's bootstrap.min.js. Now, the min, again, is the minified version. Space is taken out, certain variables are renamed so they're not so long, and so on and so forth. Now, you can also see here that I've downloaded a version of jQuery. Now, the reason I did that is because bootstrap.js depends on jQuery. And in order to get this file, I would go to jQuery.com, And let's go back to the front page, jQuery.com, and I'll click on this download link. And you'll see that there's two different jQuery versions. There's 1.x and 2.x. Well, the difference between them is none. There's no difference. The only real difference is that the 2.x does not support 6, 7, or 8, Internet Explorer 6, 7, or 8. And for now, I think we're just going to go ahead and use jQuery 1.x. But I think in the future, as we keep moving along with the course, we will switch to the jQuery 2.x, since the support for Internet Explorer is really kind of dying, and Microsoft just recently announced that basically not supporting anything in Internet Explorer, anything below version 11. So it makes sense just to move on from it, and the user base for those earlier versions is really, really small at this point. So if you download this right here and save that file to your JS folder, it will end up being jQuery.1.11.3.min.js, and this is obviously as of this recording. Let's close that up and take a look at the main HTML page. Well, the beginning of it is nothing that you haven't seen before already. You've seen this already, and there's the heading tag, or the head tag, I should say, declares to be UTF-8. This tag, or this meta tag, you haven't seen, but this is something that Bootstrap recommends you do, and basically just tells some versions of Internet Explorer that they should go ahead and use the latest version, or the latest compatibility version of its rendering engine. There's our familiar meta viewport tag, exactly the same as we had it in some of the previous lectures. And there's the HTML5 shim and response.js. And what basically this is a wait for Internet Explorer 8 to support HTML5 and media queries. Well, hopefully this is going to be taken out soon, as Internet Explorer 8 will become less and less relevant. Then we have the title tag, and finally we have the two link tags. The first one is the bootstrap.min.css. That's the actual Bootstrap CSS framework. And the second one is styles.css, and that's really our styles. If we take a look at the CSS styles, it's an empty file. We haven't really put any of our custom styles there yet. So all we're doing right now is relying on the Bootstrap framework, and we put the styles here already just so we have a placeholder for our styles in the future. Note that we declared our style after we declared the Bootstrap CSS styles. And the reason that is because we're going to be customizing whatever Bootstrap gives us, and therefore we want to be overriding what Bootstrap gives us, not having Bootstrap override what we are trying to style. Finally, we get to the body tag, and at the very end of the body tag, right before we close it, we declare some JavaScript files or some JavaScript libraries that we're going to depend on. First of all, Bootstrap JavaScript depends on jQuery, and that means that we first have to declare jQuery, and then we will declare and reference the bootstrap.js. And last, we reference our own JavaScript file, which is likely to be using either the jQuery or the Bootstrap JavaScript files. And again, if you go and actually take a look at that script.js, it's really just an empty file at this point. It's just a placeholder for our future script. Well, let's take a look at what this HTML file looks like in the browser. Well, it looks just like that. There's absolutely nothing here. And that makes sense since we really didn't put any content in. Well, let's go ahead and put some content in right now. Let's go just start with H1 and say, hello, Coursera. We save that and we go back to our browser and we see hello Coursera shows up, and clearly something's different than you would expect before. The font family clearly is not the default one, and the color is a little bit different as well. So it looks like some Bootstrap styling is being applied. Well, to verify that, let's go ahead and right click on it and go to inspect the element. And when we inspect that element, let's take a look. Yes, indeed, there's some styles that are being applied from the bootstrap.css. Another important thing to take a look at is the console, because if you misspell something or you reference the wrong JavaScript file or something like that, there would have been some errors showing up right here. And since I don't see any errors, looks like we're in good shape. So this is the basic and the base Bootstrap starter page that you could take and start coding your Bootstrap-based web pages. So to summarize, we got introduced to the most popular project on GitHub, which is Bootstrap. And we got introduced to the concept of mobile first, that is the importance of planning for the mobile version of your website from the very beginning. And we went over the bare bones Bootstrap webpage. We saw how to download and install the Bootstrap artifact files, as well as jQuery that is needed for the Bootstrap JavaScript framework. And we tested out that our Bootstrap page actually works and contains no errors. Next, we're going to talk about one of the core topics when discussing the Bootstrap CSS framework, and that is the Bootstrap grid system. Probably one of the most central components of Bootstrap that allows developers to easily create responsive layouts is the grid system. So let's go ahead and take a look how it works. So here's a quick snippet of HTML that's going to help us go through the different components of the grid system. So pretty much any Bootstrap grid layout is going to have these components as part of it. And as I mentioned before, you could see that it does impose a bit of a structure into your HTML code, but most of the time it would probably come up with this type of structure anyway. So let's go ahead and take a look as to what the structure is. First of all, your Bootstrap grid always has to be inside of a container wrapper. There are a couple of choices for that. One, you could use the container class, or you could use the container fluid class. The container fluid class stretches your layout to full width of the browser and provides consistent padding around your grid and other content. There's other content that could go into the container, not just the grid. It's just that the grid requires that it should be inside of a container wrapper. So that's container fluid. Regular container class has predetermined fixed width that is still responsive based on the width of the browser. In other words, it has a certain width of one breakpoint, a different width at a different breakpoint, and so on. Remember that breakpoints are those media query range boundaries that we covered in one of the previous lectures. The next component of the grid is the row. So the row class creates horizontal groups of columns, which means that the columns collapse and interact with each other as a group, but independently from columns in another row. The row class also creates a negative margin to counteract the padding that the container class sets up. Now, why is that done? Well, each column already has its own padding because we want to visually separate columns from each other. If negative margin wasn't applied to the row, the padding of the container would then be in addition to the padding of the edge column. So the content of the column will no longer align nicely with the rest of the content outside of the grid. Now, the Bootstrap documentation actually talks about this and explains it. But to be honest, I myself stared at it for a while before I finally understood what it's trying to say. So let me put together a quick diagram so you'll visually see what we're talking about. Okay, so obviously I'm going to start with the browser, and then I'm going to visually build up what our grid layout is going to look like. So the first thing the documentation says is we need to have an element whose class is equal container. Well, that's our element right there. It's in white. That's our container class. Then we're going to have another element inside of that is a row, at least has a class row. Except this time, just for demonstration purposes, we're not going to give it a row. We're going to give it a row no negative margin, meaning it's going to be the same row, but we're not going to give it the negative margin just for these illustration purposes. And you can see outside of our grid, but yet still within the container, we have some regular content that is basically right against the edge of the container. And then we're going to place our columns. Each column, as you can see, has some padding around it so it could separate itself from the other columns. So far so good, right? Well, not exactly. Because if you look as to where the line of the column content starts and where the line of the regular content starts, you'll see that they don't match. Now, having consistently aligned edges of different content structures within your page is actually a pretty basic design principle, and Bootstrap implements that basic design principle for you so you don't trip up. So let's go ahead and visually now fix this problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to again start with a browser and a container element with some regular content, and then we're going to add our real Bootstrap class row element. And what it does is, again, it stretches itself beyond the container. It negates the container's padding of actually 15 pixels to be exact, and it adds a negative 15 pixel margin. So what that does for our content in the columns is that it pushes it outwards. So what does that do? Well, what it does is now that our column content aligns perfectly with the regular content that is outside of our grid, but is still inside the container wrapper. Now, the concept of aligning the different edges of content blocks to each other is nothing new, and any good website actually does that. In fact, if you ever look at a website and something just doesn't feel quite right, take a look at the aligning. I bet you the aligning of different blocks of different content elements within the page aren't aligned nicely, and your eye kind of naturally tells you that something is wrong. Let's take a quick look at the web page, facebook.com/Coursera webdev, which, by the way, I'm once again encouraging you to go ahead and like and sign up for the notifications when I publish some optional free content. But let's take a look at this page, and I'll just took one little piece of that page. And if you take a look, this concept of aligning different blocks of content is alive and well here. As you can see, the picture, the text, and even the buttons below very well aligned together, and it's very pleasing to the eye, and it's easy to read. At the same time, Coursera WebDev and published by Yaakov Chaikin, right, is also very much aligned as well, and it gives it such structure such that it's pleasing to the eye, and there's certainly plenty of studies about the fact that this is the way that the human eye actually follows a web page. Okay, so that's what the row class does. Let's move on to the columns. You've seen this type of column class definition in our lecture on responsive design before. So in terms of how Bootstrap defines it, let's go ahead and take it apart. So every Bootstrap column class is defined using this template. It's col for column, dash size, and then dash span. And let's go over the components of this, or the two components of this template. First of all, the size. Well, the size is a screen width range identifier, and it's like something like MD for medium, LG for large, and so on. And you could look up what that means in the Bootstrap documentation. So, for example, LG is defined as 1200 pixels and above, so minimum of 1200 pixels. And what that means is that columns will collapse. In other words, they'll stack one upon each other below that width. So if the screen width is 1200 pixels and above for, let's say, a large size, it will go ahead and honor whatever you specified in this column dash size dash span. But if the screen width is below 1200 pixels, this class will no longer apply. And basically what that will mean is that the columns in your row will collapse on each other, meaning they will stack one on top of the other. Which basically means that if you had several columns before, now you'll just have one column because everything is going to just stack one upon the other. And that is all unless there's another rule that applies. This is assuming there's no other rules that apply. So for example, if for LG large you specified one column span, and then for a medium size you specified another column span, well, when you squeeze the browser, make the browser less wide, and you cross that threshold of 1200 pixels, the large column span will no longer apply. But if you specified an MD or medium size of the screen, that then will kick in and that will apply. And the span is really all it is how many columns the element should span. So the values are from 1 to 12. And I've mentioned many times that Bootstrap is a 12-column grid layout. And what that means is the second the columns will add up to 12, so if you specify, let's say, 4, 4, and 4, that will add up to 12. If you start specifying more than 12 columns within the row, well, they'll do what other floats do, is that they will wrap to the next row. But it won't be a row within Bootstrap, it will just basically wrap itself automatically. So point is, if you're specifying a whole bunch of columns, the element that pushes the total sum of the spans above 12 will automatically wrap to the next line. And this process can keep going every 12 columns. Lastly, there's nothing really magical about using divs as we did before in the example on the slide. You're free to use whatever makes sense to you in your design. In this example, we're using the header and nav elements to define container and row components. In part 2 of this lecture, we're going to jump into the editor and try some of these concepts out. Okay, so here I am Sublime Text, and I'm looking at the file called gridbefore.html, which is located in the examples lecture 26 folder. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and remove this HTML5 shim. It's really only needed here, as it says here, for IE8 support, and we really want to drop IE8 support at this point. It's such a minute number of people that actually are still using IE8. We're going to go ahead and just disregard that. But other than that, our file is a regular HTML starter file for a Bootstrap page. It's got the CSS that we imported. We have some custom styles imported as well. And we have jQuery, Bootstrap JS, and again, a script JS, which we might need further down the line. Let's go ahead and examine our HTML. It's very simple. It just got a bunch of divs, and I already kind of pre-made it, so we'll be able to follow the Bootstrap structure that it needs to have in order to have a Bootstrap grid system. And it's got just 3 columns, column 1, column 2, column 3. Let's go ahead and save that, and let's take a look as to what this looks like in the browser. As you can see, right now, it's just they're behaving just like regular divs. They're stacking one upon the other, column 1, column 2, column 3. So let's begin to build this out by first of all following the rule that we spoke about, is that every grid system has to be inside a container class. And in this case, we're going to go ahead and go with container fluid. What that should do is that should give us some padding on the side. So if we go back to the browser and refresh, you'll see that we got some padding here, and it's actually 15 pixels to be precise. Next, we need to place our columns inside a row class. So we're going to say class and say row. And once that's done, we can go ahead and now specify a class for each of one of our columns. And in this case, we'll go ahead and specify class equals to, and we'll say column, and we'll do MD, and let's say -4. And when we do that, that will give us 4, 4, and 4, so 3 columns across. Let's save that. Let's go ahead and take a look at what we have in the browser. We'll refresh. And voila, we have 3 columns across. Now, where did this gray and red border, gray inside and red border come from? Well, if we go back and we actually open up our CSS and look at the CSS styles.css, you'll see that I actually just pre-made some styles for row. I gave it margin 15 pixels, so between different rows that we're going to have some spacing. And row div, I basically gave it a red border and a background color of gray. So that's where that's coming from. So as you hopefully remember from the first part of the lecture, is MD is a sizing identifier that stands for some breakpoint. Let's go ahead and go to the browser and go to getbootstrap.com, and we'll go to CSS, and we'll look at the grid system and scroll down and take a look at the stable that they have here. And it will tell you what MD stands for. MD stands for anything above 992 pixels. So according to this, it means that anything below this will cause our columns to stack upon the other, one upon each other. So right now they're behaving like regular columns. So if I open Chrome Developer Tools, as I squeeze the browser, in the top right corner, we'll see how wide the browser is in pixels, and I should be able to get to 992 pixels wide for the screen without anything collapsing or the columns not stacking one upon the other. But the second I get to 991, which will be one less, so that means the MD style set of styles will no longer apply, and these columns will stack one upon the other. So let's go ahead and do that. So we are right now at 993, 92, and then we'll go to 91. It becomes stacking one upon the other. So hopefully that kind of shows you what that MD really means. It means when the columns will start collapsing one upon the other. So as I mentioned in part 1, that's only because there's no other styles really that are specified here. However, if we went ahead and specified a different style that will be in the range that we spoke about, which is below 992 pixels, 991 and below. So for that, we'll say small, we'll make it 6. So if we make this 6, that means that column 1 will take half the screen, column 2 will take half the screen, and since we're still in the same row, column 3 will go ahead and wrap to the next line, and it will still take half the screen. So let's go ahead and save that and go back to our browser. We'll refresh, and as we start squeezing the browser, when we get to less than 992, what's going to happen is the first column is going to take half the screen, the second column is going to take half the screen, and the third one will also take half the screen, but it will wrap itself on the next line. However, that's not the end of it. If we go back to the documentation and take a look, the small that we specified has a breakpoint of 768 pixels. So which means that these columns will still collapse and stack one upon the other if I squeeze the browser below 768 pixels. So let's go ahead and try to do that. And we'll go back here, and 768 right around here, 768, 67, and therefore it starts collapsing. So the collapsing will still happen, it will just happen at a different breakpoint. Okay, so let's make the browser back up to the full screen. So let's go back to our code, and we'll go ahead and copy this whole row, and we'll paste it again. And if we do that, now we visually separated row number 1 from row number 2. So if we go back to the browser and refresh, remember I created some margin below the row. So now you see exactly the same thing. And as we squeeze the browser, they will both sets of rows will behave exactly the same way. So you can see the first set of rows is behaving 1, 2, and 3 on the second line, and so is the second row is behaving 1, 2. And the third column is on the line right below. Okay, so there's one more variation that I should show you that you should really have to pay attention to. So let's go back to the documentation, and let's take a look at this table one more time. You could see that the grid behavior is a little bit different for extra small, the col XS, versus the rest of them. The grid behavior says here it's going to be horizontal at all times, as opposed to the ones that are small, medium, or large. They'll be collapsed to start, and they will be horizontal above breakpoints. So basically, they'll be stacking below these numbers, but anything above that, they will actually be horizontal and try to lay themselves out. Which means that if you want to guarantee that there is always going to be a particular layout, you could just specify it in the col XS, and it will stay no matter what the size of the screen. That's the layout that will stay. Let's go ahead and go back to the code editor and test this out. Let's scroll down a little bit here, and we'll copy this row right here, and we'll make another row just like that. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and remove actually just about everything here, and we'll say column XS, extra small, and 6. So now what we're saying is that we want the first column to take up half the screen, the second to take up half the screen, and the third to wrap around and take up half the screen, but we want that to always happen. In other words, we don't want it to collapse at any point or do anything different at any point. So if we go back to the browser, and we'll go ahead and refresh this page, you see that even above 1200 pixels, that's what it is right now, it is still staying in this particular layout. And if I squeeze the browser more and more, it will continue staying in this layout. So at a certain point, even those columns will collapse because they're specified as small. Let's go back to our code editor. As you can see, they're specified as small. So the second we go below the small breakpoint, this too will collapse. However, since this is specified as XS, that will never collapse. It will always stay exactly the same. So to summarize, we spoke about the structure that the Bootstrap expects for the grid-based layout to work. In other words, the grid needs to be inside of the container class or container fluid class, and also all columns must be inside an element with the row class. We spoke about the Bootstrap grid system column classes and the fact that they have a size identifier that identifies at which breakpoint specified column spans will be ignored, and then all elements will collapse. In other words, the columns will start stacking one upon the other. And as part of our demo, we spoke about the fact that if no other rules apply, specifying column XS will keep that layout no matter what size of the screen. Next, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to get into a little bit more of a business/requirements analysis and requirements gathering type of mode. And I'll try to go over some basic ideas as to what to expect when you visit with a real client.
is もしうまくて、どうかな。すごい一発になりますね。どうかな。見てなかった。次は第4章。眠い。まあ、いろんなアプライもよし。どうした。待って、これ終了としてマークで十分でしょ。ああ。
Okay, you have finished about half the course. Congratulations. If you didn't know HTML and CSS before, or didn't know it well, take a moment and look back. You're now way more skilled than a lot of people who simply mess around with HTML and CSS without knowing the foundational concepts. Take a moment and reflect. It's pretty empowering, isn't it? In the next module, we'll start coding a real website for a real client. Keep going to module 3. You do not want to miss this.
とりあえずどういうテストをするか。マスクです。if you are falling behind the machine assignment,モジュールにコーディングアセンス。Double community was that you will use. Twitter ブースト進めることのフレームワーク。こういう風に作りましょうという。これは、後でやりましょう。ちょっと今日疲れてて眠いし。 の夜を使ったからな。はい、今回はここまでにします。あとは夜になったらやるつもりです。番組終了と。